Hello and welcome to the lecture on evolutionary psychology. And as I'm sure you can surmise, this is the study of human psychology with an evolutionary perspective. At the beginning of class, we discussed how evolution is a theory, and as a theory, it helps us pose new questions and new hypotheses. And that's exactly what evolutionary theory has done for psychology. It's really opened up a whole new area of research and new ways we can ask questions about the human mind. So evolutionary psychology hypothesizes that human psychology is a product of natural selection. As such, how humans faced problems in the past would have affected their differential survival and reproductive success, and people with psychologies that aided them in solving these problems in ways that increased their survival and reproduction would have left this behavior towards us today. So people who could solve these problems more efficiently or more effectively would have more kids, and we've inherited this evolutionary psychology. Now, one drawback of evolutionary psychology is that it primarily discusses psychology in a time of human evolution before culture. So it generally ignores culture, instead looking past human differences and looking for universals in human psychology. And you can see how this is politically very appealing because evolutionary psychologists always get to say, all humans do this, all humans do that, see how similar we really are. Where some of the tougher questions about discussing human differences, which are a bit more politically challenging to handle, are left to other researchers. So back to evolutionary psychology. What are some examples of commonly faced problems that humans might have evolved psychological mechanisms to help solve? Well, fear of snakes and spiders, a common threat in past human environments. It might have been adaptive to have a fear of these, so you stay away, don't get bitten, survive longer. But humans today are much more likely to die in car crashes, and yet we don't see a car and start screaming and running in the other direction. We've also discussed particular smells, how smells like dung might be disgusting to us, and how we react to potential biological contamination. This is part of our psychology. Smells are just molecules, after all. The fact that we enjoy watching things like soap operas and reality television shows about human dramas and conflicts and reputations, but we don't really enjoy watching people do math, although the spelling bee is becoming more and more popular. People are generally attracted to shows about human relationships, and this might have been adaptive in a time when we lived in small bands, and your relationship was often your passport to survival and reproductive success. We can also discuss a taste for fats and sugars. In our evolutionary history, people who found these things delicious would have eaten more of them. They're very calorie-dense foods, so if you've got more calories, you've got a larger budget, you can sustain more pregnancies, search for more mates, generally increase your survival and reproductive success. Now, this last point we'll talk about more in the next couple of lectures, but we gain a lot of our behaviors by learning them from other people, and being able to target the successful or prestigious individuals and being able to copy their behavior might be adaptive, because then we would get the successful or prestigious behavior. So we might see these evolved psychological learning mechanisms that targets who we learn from socially. Now this fits more into the next lecture because, as I said earlier, evolutionary psychologists generally want to ignore culture, but it could nevertheless be part of our evolved psychology. So what does the environment that they're imagining posing all these challenges for people look like? It's abbreviated as the EEA, and that stands for the Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness. And this is probably from anywhere from 6 million years ago to about 50,000 years ago, but evolutionary psychologists tend to focus on the Pleistocene, or a time really around 2 million years ago. It's a time when humans were anatomically modern, but we've spent the last 2 million years in these small hunter-gatherer bands, primarily in the savannas of Africa, facing all of these challenges, avoiding predators, finding mates, caring for children, cooperating with other members in your band. And so you can see how these are more like general level problems that people faced, and then evolutionary psychologists look for the mechanisms that would have helped people solve these challenges. And the method that they use is fairly straightforward, since all of these psychological adaptations come from a time when humans were living in Africa and nowhere else. Since we have migrated elsewhere, we can still look for these universals everywhere. So if we find a behavior that we observe cross-culturally, then we can hypothesize that this was a psychological mechanism that evolved before humans migrated out of Africa. Because of this, evolutionary psychologists generally test easily accessible populations, meaning undergraduate students on university campuses, primarily in the US and Europe. And what they'll do is they'll give surveys or they'll have experimental manipulations to see how individuals respond to different situations, and if they see general patterns, perhaps males responding one way, females responding another, everybody responding a certain way to a situation like being presented with a spider, then they imagine that this is evidence. Well, then they would explain this as evidence for an evolved psychological mechanism. So let's look at an example of, and this is a mate choice experiment, and it's like evolutionary psychologists love to study mate choice.
There's a new group of scientists called evolutionary psychologists, and they're interested in how human evolutionary history affects the way we think today. Now keep in mind that that means 4 million years of evolutionary history, a time during which we were almost always roaming the plains and forests of Africa. How does that affect the way we operate today? They've been looking at things like mate choice, different kinds of standards of beauty, social exchange. And they have a very long way to go before they can prove some of their ideas, but they're still some of the most interesting and provocative issues around today.
Evolutionary psychologists begin by pointing out that, regardless of the culture in which we grow up, we all tend to respond the same way to a surprising variety of things. Most of us find spiders unpleasant, certain body types sexy, and particular smells disgusting. All, they say, are legacies of our evolutionary past.
If we ask, for example, do rotten eggs smell bad? It's just a molecule. Hydrogen sulfide gas, it doesn't have a smell. We have evolved a brain to generate a negative feeling for something that's detrimental to our gene survival. This indicates biological contamination, right? If you were a dung beetle, the smell of rotten eggs might smell wonderful to you, because the smell doesn't reside in the molecule, it resides in the evolved brain.
Another deeply embedded instinct we may have inherited from our ancestors is the ability to smell a genetically compatible mate. In one unusual experiment, scientists had young men sleep in the same t-shirt for a couple of nights, until the shirts were infused with their unique smell. It turns out, when women were asked to rate the sex appeal of the different men based only on the smell of the shirts, they consistently rated higher the shirts of men whose immune genes were unlike their own. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Choosing a mate with different immune genes gives offspring a greater protection against viruses, parasites, and other pathogens. The ability to smell good genes is a remarkable talent. But like most instincts, we don't even know it's at work. We just like the way someone smells, or the way they look, or because they make us laugh.
People don't have sex because they want to perpetuate their genes. They don't like someone because they want to get better genes. They do things because they feel good to them. They have sex because it feels good. The relationship between those good feelings and gene survival may not even be known to them. They never think about that. They do things because it feels good, and they never think, why do those things feel good? Why have we evolved a brain that makes certain things feel bad to us or certain things feel good to us? And that's the question that we're addressing.
So one benefit of evolutionary psychology is that they focus a lot on the mechanism, how adaptive solutions could be reached. When we discussed human behavioral ecology, we noted that there's a lot of study on the outcome of the behavior, but there is very little attention to what mechanism might promote a behavior. Evolutionary psychology has the opposite criticism. They do a great job of studying the mechanisms, but there's very little data on the adaptive outcomes. Are these women who are preferring men with different immune genes, do they actually have increased survival and reproduction than an individual who doesn't, for example? And they just don't collect this kind of data. It's enough for evolutionary psychologists or most evolutionary psychologists to find, say, a cross-cultural effect in different data sets and then to tell a good evolutionary story. Now, one area of inquiry that they have brought up that is quite interesting to think about is this concept of evolutionary mismatch. And the idea goes, okay, our psychology evolved, 2 to 4 million years ago to handle situations that were commonly faced then. In modern environments, sometimes that ancient psychology misfires in response to novel situations that were encountered in the Pleistocene. So things like road rage. Road rage is imagined to come out of this behavior for maintaining reputation. So you're in the Pleistocene, you're sitting around the campfire, someone knocks your, Pleistocene s'more into the fire, and you punch them in the face. You have this reputation to maintain that if they mess with you, there's going to be consequences. Same thing for road rage. Someone cuts you off on the freeway, you get upset, you crash your car into them. However, this context is very different because, one, you'll probably never see that other driver again, and two, the other drivers on the road who have observed your behavior will probably never see you again, so you've paid the cost, but you haven't reaped the benefit, and this benefit would have potentially been there in the EEA, for example. This food preferences for fat and sugars, very beneficial in the Pleistocene, increased calories, increased survival and reproductive success. However, in modern hyper-nourished populations, preferences for fat and sugar lead to things like cardiac disease and type 2 diabetes. So we might be out of sync with the environmental pressures and the way that we respond to different cues in the environment. Some of these might be beneficial. The fact that we can convince strangers to treat each other like kin, perhaps out of this ancient psychology where you're always dealing with people that you are familiar with. This quote, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," getting people to cooperate in large-scale warfare because their comrades in arms are like their brothers, for example. One potential solution to dealing with this concept of the EEA and this ancient psychology that misfires in modern environments is thinking about not the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness as this period about 2 million years ago, but thinking about the environment of adaptive relevance of different traits. Physical anthropologists think of humans as a mosaic of traits from various points in our evolutionary history. So we have primate hands that evolved about 65 million years ago. We have color vision that evolved about 50 million years ago. Our ability to use tools came around about 2.5 million years ago. Lactose tolerance, or the ability to digest lactose as adults, evolved in some populations probably about 6,000 years ago. So when you think about the human body, it's really a composite of different traits that evolved in different times, and it might be beneficial to think about the human psychology in the same way. Our psychology is probably a composite of different traits, different responses, acquired during different points in our evolutionary history, and we can't ignore the fact, as physical anthropologists have observed, that humans are continuing to evolve, and we're continuing to respond to environmental pressures. So you can tell that I'm a little skeptical of evolutionary psychology. I think it's great in concept, but I think the research has yet to engage in the type of scientific rigor that we observe in other ways to study the evolution of human behavior. And so I just wanted to end this little lecture on having you think more seriously about some of these concepts that I've brought up. There's a lot about the psychology that I haven't discussed, like feelings about right and wrong. We neglected culture on purpose. That's what we're going to talk about in our next lectures. Think again about how scientifically rigorous this research is. Most of it is done among undergraduate students in the US and Europe. These are weird populations, primarily white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic compared to most of our evolutionary history. How emblematic is this really of all of humanity? And if you were to become an evolutionary psychologist, it's a very attractive field of study. How would you do this better, essentially? So I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and see you next time for culture. Thanks for listening.